The first time I learned my cabin had been sold, a stranger texted me a photograph of himself standing on my porch with the caption, "Thanks for the view." I was 4,000 miles away in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, and I remember setting the phone down on my cot with the kind of careful stillness you only learn in a war zone, because some part of me already understood that the next few minutes were going to rearrange everything that came after them. Before I tell you what happened, if stories about people who get underestimated and come back swinging pull you in, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position, because I promise this one will not go where you expect. My name is Easton Voss, and the person who orchestrated the sale of my land while I was deployed was my mother-in-law, Marlene Dupree, a woman who ran the Stonebrook Glen HOA board like a fiefdom and had despised me since the night I publicly asked her why the board had seized a widow's garden shed over a $40 fee. My cabin sat on 4 acres that predated the HOA entirely, protected by an irrevocable agricultural exemption filed in 1987. Marlene had never been able to touch it, and that fact had eaten at her for years. What I didn't know, sitting in that tent with my hands shaking, was that 6 months into my deployment, my wife Wren had been diagnosed with a recurring illness she'd hidden from me, terrified that telling me would pull me out of theater and put my unit at risk. She told her mother instead. I assumed the entire flight home that Marlene had seen an opening for cruelty and taken it. I was wrong about that, but I was also wrong about what I thought I'd find once I understood the truth, and that's where this stopped being a simple story about a vindictive in-law. I landed and went straight to the county recorder's office before anyone knew I was back. The lien Marlene had used to force the auction was fraudulent on its face. Forged signatures, a sympathetic clerk named Holt Bregman who'd processed it without proper authority, and a parcel that legally couldn't be touched by HOA jurisdiction at all. The sale was void from the moment it was filed. I had enough documentation to end Marlene's career and possibly send Bregman to prison. I drove to her house ready to use every page on it. She wasn't alone when I arrived. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table was a man I didn't recognize. Mid-50s, expensive coat, the kind of calm that comes from being comfortable in rooms where other people are afraid. His name was Castor Liang, the investor who'd bought my cabin at auction, and he was not, as I'd assumed, an unwitting bystander who'd simply seen a good deal. He'd known Marlene for 2 years. He ran a small portfolio of properties he acquired specifically through irregular municipal auctions, properties with clouded titles or procedural defects, because once he held possession for long enough, defending a void sale in court became more expensive for the original owner than simply walking away. Marlene hadn't sold me my cabin by accident. She'd sold it to a man who specialized in making fraudulent acquisitions permanent through attrition, and she'd done it because she needed enough cash fast enough that an actual market sale, with inspections and appraisals and time, wouldn't have worked. That reframed everything. This wasn't a grieving mother making one desperate, forgivable mistake. This was a coordinated transaction with a professional partner who had done this before, successfully, to other people who didn't have my training in reading documents or my willingness to walk into a recorder's office before I even called my own wife. I asked Castor directly how many other properties he'd acquired this way. He smiled and told me that was privileged information, which told me everything I needed to know. I left without saying what I'd planned to say. Confronting Marlene that day would have meant tipping my hand before I understood the size of what I was dealing with, so instead I drove 2 hours to the next county over and found Holt Bregman's supervisor, a meticulous woman named Adaze Corlew, who had been quietly building a procedural irregularities file on Bregman for 8 months without enough evidence to act. My documents were the missing piece. Within a week, Bregman was suspended pending investigation, and 3 other auctions he'd processed over the past 2 years were flagged for review. One of them belonged to a retired school teacher named Otis Morrow, who had lost his home 18 months earlier under circumstances that, once cross-referenced, matched my case almost exactly. Castor Liang's name was on that title, too. This is the part I didn't expect. Otis Morrow had spent 1.5 years believing he'd simply lost a legal fight he didn't understand, that the system had worked correctly and he'd come up short. When Corlu's office contacted him, he didn't react with relief. He reacted with rage, the controlled, exhausted rage of a man who'd quietly accepted a loss that turned out to have been engineered, and he wanted Marlene and Castor prosecuted with everything available, no quiet resolutions, no resignations in lieu of consequences. He had every right to want that, and unlike me, he had no relationship with Marlene clouding his judgment. I realized that whatever I decided to do about my own situation, I no longer had the only voice in the room. I went to see Ren before deciding anything else, and what waited for me wasn't the picture I'd built on the flight home. I found my wife exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, furious at her mother in a way I'd never seen, and carrying a guilt that had nothing to do with the fraud itself. She told me Marlene had asked her weeks earlier for permission to handle things, and Ren had said yes without asking what that meant, because she was too sick and too scared to push for details. She hadn't authorized fraud, but she'd authorized her mother to act, and that distinction, she said, didn't make her feel any less responsible. Marlene was charged. I didn't stop it, and honestly, by the time Otis Morrow's case surfaced, it was no longer mine to stop. The county was prosecuting based on a pattern, not a single grievance. What I controlled was narrower than I expected and smaller than the satisfying ending I'd imagined on that flight home. My cabin's title was restored once the sale was voided. Castor Liang's other acquisitions came under a state-level review that as of this year has unwound 4 separate auctions and resulted in restitution for homeowners who'd long since given up. Marlene took a plea agreement that included restitution to Otis Morrow and 2 others, a permanent ban from any HOA governance role in the state, and 18 months of supervised probation. She did not go to prison, largely because Corlu's office needed her cooperation to build the larger case against Bregman and Liang, and Marlene, finally cornered, gave it. Ren and I are still married, though it took us almost 1 year to talk about that day at the kitchen table without one of us leaving the room. Her treatment worked. She's healthy now, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that doesn't make for a dramatic ending, but matters more than anything else in this story. Marlene and I have spoken exactly twice since her sentencing, both times brief, both times necessary, neither time resembling forgiveness. I didn't get a clean reconciliation or a villain who saw the light. I got my land back. A stranger named Otis Morrow got his life's worth of dignity back through a process that had nothing to do with me, and a system that had been quietly failing people for years finally had a light shined into it because I happened to know how to read a deed. Some stories end with everyone making peace. This one ends with the right people finally being held to account and the rest of us learning to live with what that cost.